Welcome, dear companion, to another quiet exploration through the corridors of time. Tonight, we venture into the marble halls of ancient Rome, where power and justice dance together in ways both magnificent and troubling. As you settle into your comfortable space, perhaps with a warm cup of tea nearby, let us walk together through these ancient streets where every whispered word carried weight, and every gesture was observed by unseen eyes. The story we'll discover tonight is one of human nature itself, how societies create rules, how power shapes behavior, and how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. It's a tale that unfolds not with dramatic battles or sudden violence, but with the slow, careful movements of a civilization trying to maintain order across vast distances and countless cultures in the bustling streets of ancient Rome, where merchants hawked their wares and citizens gathered in the forums to discuss the affairs of the day. There lived a man named Gaius Flavius Maximus. He was neither wealthy nor poor, neither famous nor forgotten, simply one of the countless souls who called the eternal city home. Maximus worked as a scribe in the imperial administration, carefully copying documents and recording the endless stream of bureaucratic matters that kept the empire functioning. Like many Romans of his time, Maximus had grown up hearing stories of the old republic, when senators debated freely and citizens could speak their minds without fear. His grandfather, Lucius Flavius, had often told him tales of those distant days when a man's word was measured by its truth, rather than its loyalty to whoever held power at the moment. But those days seemed as distant as the stars. Under the rule of Emperor Aurelius Severus, a name that commanded immediate silence whenever spoken, the very air of Rome had grown thick with unspoken cautions. Citizens had learned to choose their words as carefully as a jeweler selects precious stones. For the wrong phrase, spoken to the wrong person, could shatter a life as easily as dropping a crystal goblet on marble floors. The transformation had been gradual, like the slow changing of seasons. What had once been spirited discussions about policy had become careful recitations of approved opinions. Where citizens had once gathered to debate the merits of various proposals, they now assembled to demonstrate their unanimous support for whatever the emperor had decreed. The forums that had once echoed with passionate arguments now resonated with the rhythmic chanting of loyalty oaths. Maximus often wondered, as he sat at his writing desk in the quiet hours before dawn, when exactly the change had begun. Had there been a single moment when freedom of speech had died, or had it simply faded away like morning mist under the rising sun? His careful observations had taught him that the transformation was more subtle than a sudden law or dramatic decree. Instead, it had crept through Roman society like water seeping through stone, gradually reshaping everything it touched. The legal framework that governed what Romans could and could not say had expanded like ripples in a pond. Initially, the concept of betraying the state had been quite simple: selling military secrets to enemies, plotting to assassinate leaders, or actively working to overthrow the government. These were clear, understandable crimes that most citizens could easily avoid. But over time, the definition had grown broader and more encompassing. A casual criticism of imperial policy might be interpreted as undermining state authority. A joke about the emperor's appearance could be twisted into an attack on imperial dignity. Even silence could become suspicious. Why wasn't someone more vocal in their praise of recent government achievements? This expansion created an atmosphere where citizens found themselves walking through a minefield of potential interpretations. Maximus had learned to speak in careful, measured tones, avoiding any phrase that might be misconstrued. He had watched colleagues disappear from their positions after careless comments, their desks cleared out quietly in the night, their names gradually fading from official records as if they had never existed at all. The psychological impact of this uncertainty was profound. When people cannot predict what might trigger punishment, they tend to retreat into extreme caution. Maximus observed how conversations at the public baths had become stilted and formal. Friends who had once shared their deepest thoughts now spoke only of the weather and the latest gladiatorial games. Even family gatherings had grown careful and constrained, with relatives eyeing each other warily across dinner tables that had once been filled with lively debate. The emperor's administrators understood the power of this uncertainty. By keeping the boundaries of acceptable behavior deliberately vague, they ensured that citizens would police themselves far more effectively than any army of guards could manage. People began to internalize the state's perspective, gradually adopting the emperor's viewpoint as their own to avoid the psychological stress of constantly monitoring their thoughts and words. Maximus had noticed how this process affected even his own thinking. He found himself automatically translating his private observations into approved language before they could fully form in his mind. The mental habit of self-censorship had become so ingrained that he sometimes wondered whether his thoughts were truly his own anymore, or whether they were simply echoes of what he had been trained to think. The imperial court had also perfected the art of making loyalty visible and measurable. Citizens were expected to participate in regular ceremonies honoring the emperor, to contribute to public monuments celebrating imperial achievements, and to display portraits of the imperial family in their homes and businesses. These weren't mere suggestions, but practical requirements for anyone hoping to maintain their position in society. Failure to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for these displays of loyalty could itself become evidence of disloyalty. Maximus had learned to smile broadly during public ceremonies, to applaud at precisely the right moments, and to speak the required phrases with convincing sincerity. Like actors in endless play, Roman citizens had become performers of their own patriotism. The weight of this constant performance was exhausting. Citizens found themselves monitoring not only their words, but their facial expressions, their gestures, their timing of applause. Even genuine emotions became suspect. Was someone's joy at imperial announcements real enough? Was their sorrow at news of setbacks appropriately deep? The line between authentic feeling and required performance had blurred until many people could no longer distinguish between the two. As Maximus walked home through the torchlit streets each evening, he often reflected on how thoroughly this system had transformed Roman society. The confident, forthright citizens his grandfather had described seemed like characters from ancient myths, brave and noble figures who belonged to a different world entirely. The Romans of his time had learned different virtues: caution, discretion, and the ability to read the subtle signs that indicated which way the political winds were blowing. Yet even as he recognized the constraints of his world, Maximus found himself grateful for the stability it provided. The empire remained strong, the borders secure, the grain shipments arriving on schedule. Perhaps this was the price of order, the gradual restriction of certain freedoms in exchange for peace and prosperity. The question that haunted him in quiet moments was whether the cost had been worth paying, and whether there might have been another way to achieve the same security without sacrificing so much of what had once made Roman citizenship feel like a privilege rather than a burden. Chapter 2. The Web of Watching In. The narrow streets that wound between Rome's 7 hills, where the scent of baking bread mingled with incense from countless household shrines, lived a woman named Claudia Livia. She was a merchant's wife, known throughout her neighborhood for her skill in weaving fine textiles and her generous spirit toward those in need. Her small shop, tucked between a pottery maker and a wine cellar, had always been a gathering place where neighbors could share news and gossip while examining her latest creations. But Claudia had begun to notice changes in the rhythm of these daily interactions. Conversations that had once flowed freely now seemed carefully orchestrated, with each participant weighing their words before speaking. The easy laughter that had once filled her shop had become more subdued. And certain topics, once the staple of neighborhood discussion, had simply vanished from conversation altogether. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Where neighbors had once debated the merits of various civic improvements, they now spoke only in generalities about the wisdom of imperial leadership. Where they had once shared complaints about rising prices or difficult working conditions, they now emphasized their gratitude for the stability that strong government provided. The organic, spontaneous discussions that had made her shop feel alive had been replaced by something that felt more like a carefully rehearsed performance. Claudia's growing unease was well-founded. Throughout the empire, a vast network of observers had been quietly established, not through any grand announcement or official decree, but through a combination of incentives and pressures that made reporting on one's neighbors seem like both a patriotic duty and a practical necessity. The system worked through careful psychological manipulation rather than crude intimidation. Citizens were not commanded to spy on each other. Instead, they were offered rewards for information about suspicious activities while being subtly warned about the consequences of failing to report such activities when they came to light through other means. Marcus Tullius Corvus, a grain inspector who lived 3 streets away from Claudia's shop, had discovered how the system operated when he was approached by an imperial administrator named Quintus Horatius. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of the public baths, where the sound of splashing water would mask their conversation from potential eavesdroppers. Horatius was a soft-spoken man with intelligent eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put people at ease. He began their conversation by praising Corvus for his diligent work in ensuring the quality of Rome's grain supply, a crucial responsibility that kept the citizenry fed and content. This praise felt genuine and well-deserved, as Corvus took pride in his work and understood its importance to the stability of the city. As their conversation continued, Horatius gradually shifted to broader topics: the challenges of maintaining order in a city as large and diverse as Rome, the difficulties of identifying potential threats to public safety, the importance of citizens who cared about their community, helping to keep it secure. He spoke not of spying or betrayal, but of civic responsibility and protecting one's neighbors from harm. The actual request, when it came, seemed almost reasonable. Horatius simply asked Corvus to keep his ears open for any conversations that might suggest someone was planning activities harmful to the public welfare, not to seek out such conversations or to interrogate his neighbors, but simply to remember and report anything that naturally came to his attention in the course of his daily interactions. In return for this civic service, Corvus would receive a modest supplement to his income, presented not as payment for spying, but as recognition of his expanded responsibilities in maintaining public safety. If his reports led to the prevention of serious crimes, he might be eligible for more substantial rewards, including possible advancement within the imperial administration. The request seemed entirely reasonable to Corvus. After all, any good citizen would naturally report genuine threats to public safety. The fact that he would be compensated for this civic duty simply reflected the emperor's wisdom in encouraging responsible behavior. He agreed without feeling that he was crossing any moral boundary. Similar conversations were taking place throughout the city, as administrators like Horatius carefully recruited a network of observers from every level of society. They selected individuals who were respected in their communities, who had demonstrated loyalty to the state, and who could be trusted to exercise judgment in their reporting. These were not the desperate or the criminal, but solid citizens who genuinely believed they were serving their community's best interests. The psychological sophistication of this approach was remarkable. By framing surveillance as civic responsibility, the administrators avoided creating the sense of a police state while achieving the same practical results. Citizens who might have resented being commanded to spy on their neighbors willingly participated in what they understood as community protection efforts. Claudia began to notice the effects of this network in small but unmistakable ways. Conversations in her shop became shorter and more focused on immediate business. Neighbors who had once lingered to chat about their families or their work now conducted their transactions efficiently and departed quickly. The warm social atmosphere that had made her shop a center of neighborhood life gradually cooled into something more formal and transactional. She also observed changes in how people interacted with each other on the street. The casual greetings and spontaneous conversations that had once characterized neighborhood life became more structured and predictable. People seemed to be following unspoken scripts, saying what was expected rather than what they actually thought or felt. The most troubling change was in the children. Claudia had always enjoyed watching the local children play in the small square near her shop, their games and arguments providing a constant source of entertainment and occasional concern. But even their play had begun to reflect a new atmosphere of caution. She noticed them incorporating elements of imperial ceremony into their games, playing at being loyal citizens rather than rebels or pirates as children had done in previous generations. More disturbing was overhearing fragments of conversation between children that suggested they were repeating adult discussions about the importance of proper behavior and correct thinking. The innocent curiosity and questioning that had once characterized childhood seemed to be giving way to a premature awareness of social expectations and the importance of conformity. The network of observation had achieved something more comprehensive than mere surveillance. It had created a culture of self-consciousness that penetrated every level of social interaction. People became aware that they were potentially being watched not just by official authorities, but by anyone around them. This awareness changed behavior in subtle but profound ways, encouraging conformity and discouraging the kind of spontaneous expression that had once given Roman social life its vitality. Corvus, meanwhile, found his new responsibilities weighing on him in unexpected ways. Initially, he had nothing significant to report. His neighbors and colleagues seemed to be going about their daily lives without engaging in any activities that could be construed as threatening to public order. But as weeks passed, he felt increasing pressure to justify the trust and compensation he had received from Horatius. He began to pay closer attention to casual comments that might have deeper implications. A neighbor's complaint about grain prices became worth noting, not because it was necessarily seditious, but because it showed dissatisfaction with current conditions. A colleague's joke about imperial policies was remembered and considered, not because it was clearly treasonous, but because humor could sometimes mask more serious criticism. The psychological pressure to find something worth reporting gradually changed how Corvus interpreted the conversations around him. Comments that he might previously have dismissed as harmless venting began to seem potentially significant. Relationships that had once felt straightforward became complex as he found himself analyzing the political implications of everyday social interactions. This transformation was precisely what the system was designed to achieve. By creating a network of citizens who felt responsible for monitoring their communities, the authorities had effectively distributed the burden of surveillance throughout society itself, rather than requiring a massive apparatus of professional spies. They had created conditions where ordinary citizens would monitor each other as a natural part of their daily lives. The long-term effects of this system extended far beyond its immediate practical results. The constant awareness of potential observation changed how people thought about their relationships with others. Trust became a luxury that fewer people could afford, as the possibility of betrayal lurked beneath even the most ordinary social interactions. Claudia noticed this change in her own thinking. She found herself analyzing the motivations of her customers more carefully, wondering whether their friendly questions about her business or her family reflected genuine interest or something more calculating. The easy openness that had once characterized her relationships with neighbors was gradually replaced by a more guarded and strategic approach to social interaction. The beauty of this system, from the perspective of those who designed it, was its self-perpetuating nature. As social trust eroded and people became more isolated from each other, they became increasingly dependent on official sources of information and guidance. The horizontal bonds that might have supported alternative viewpoints or collective resistance were systematically weakened, leaving citizens connected primarily through their shared relationship to the state. Yet the true genius of the network lay not in its ability to uncover actual threats to public order, but in its power to shape behavior through the mere possibility of observation. Citizens modified their actions not because they were actually being watched, but because they might be watched. This uncertainty created a form of voluntary compliance that was far more efficient than any system of direct coercion could have been done. As the seasons turned and this new social order became normalized, Claudia found herself adapting to the changed atmosphere in ways she hadn't expected. Her shop remained successful, her customers continued to appreciate her work, and her daily life proceeded with the same familiar rhythms it had always followed. But something essential had changed. In the quality of these interactions, a warmth and spontaneity that had once made even commercial transactions feel like expressions of community connection. The network of watching had achieved its primary objective, creating a society where citizens monitored themselves and each other, where potentially dangerous thoughts were discouraged before they could develop into dangerous actions, and where the stability of the state was maintained through the voluntary cooperation of its subjects rather than through the application of force. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Basilica Julia as citizens began to gather for what would become one of the most memorable trials in recent memory. The case of Lucius Antonius Crispus had been the subject of whispered conversations throughout Rome for weeks, and now the moment had arrived when justice would be publicly displayed for all to witness. Crispus had been a respected member of the senatorial class, known for his eloquence in debate and his careful attention to legal precedent. His family traced their lineage back to the early Republic, and their name appeared on monuments throughout the city as patrons of various public works. But on this gray morning, as guards escorted him to face the tribunal, he appeared diminished, still dignified, but carrying himself with the careful restraint of a man who understood that his words would be weighed for meanings beyond their surface intent. The charges against Crispus were both serious and strangely vague. He stood accused of activities harmful to the public welfare, of correspondence that showed insufficient loyalty to imperial policies, and of expressing views that might undermine confidence in state leadership. The evidence would be presented by a prosecutor named Gaius Valerius Maximus, a rising star in the imperial administration, known for his skill in discovering hidden meanings in seemingly innocent actions. Tribune Flavius Marcellus presided over the proceedings with the grave dignity that such occasions demanded. He was a fair man by the standards of his time, genuinely committed to following proper legal procedures while ensuring that the interests of the state were protected. The trial would be conducted according to established traditions, with witnesses called, evidence presented, and arguments heard from both sides. But anyone familiar with such proceedings understood that this was as much a performance as a legal determination. The outcome had been largely predetermined by the simple fact that charges had been brought. In the current atmosphere, accusations of disloyalty were rarely made without substantial confidence in their ultimate success. The trial served purposes beyond determining guilt or innocence. It provided an opportunity for the community to observe the consequences of stepping beyond acceptable boundaries. The first witness called was Marcus Cornelius Lentulus, a longtime friend of Crispus who had shared many dinners and conversations with the accused. Lentulus took the witness stand with obvious reluctance, his hands trembling slightly as he swore the required oath to speak truthfully. Prosecutor Maximus approached him with the calm confidence of a craftsman who understood his tools perfectly. "You have known the accused for many years," Maximus began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded basilica. "During your friendship, did he ever express views about imperial policy that surprised you?" Lentulus hesitated, clearly understanding the implications of his answer. "We discussed many topics over the years," he replied carefully. "Lucius was always a thoughtful man who considered issues from multiple perspectives." "Indeed," Maximus agreed. "And in considering these multiple perspectives, did he ever suggest that current policies might be improved through different approaches?" "He sometimes wondered about the best methods for achieving shared goals," Lentulus admitted, his voice barely audible. "Can you recall specific instances when he expressed such wondering?" And so the questioning continued, with Maximus skillfully extracting admissions that painted a picture of a man who thought too much and questioned too freely. Each answer, carefully extracted and interpreted, became another thread in a web of implications that gradually surrounded Crispus with the appearance of disloyalty. The genius of this approach lay in its use of genuine facts to create misleading impressions. Crispus had indeed questioned certain policies, but in the spirit of constructive engagement rather than rebellious opposition. He had expressed concerns about specific implementations, but with the goal of achieving better results rather than undermining authority. He had discussed alternative approaches, but as intellectual exercises rather than practical plans for resistance. Under different circumstances, these same conversations might have been praised as evidence of thoughtful citizenship and constructive engagement with public affairs. But in the current environment, they became proof of dangerous tendencies that threaten public order. The transformation of virtue into vice was accomplished through careful presentation rather than outright fabrication. Crispus himself was eventually called to testify in his own defense. He spoke with the eloquence that had made him respected in the Senate, carefully explaining his motivations and providing context for the conversations that had been portrayed as evidence of his guilt. His words were measured and dignified, reflecting both his understanding of the legal proceedings and his awareness that he was speaking not just to the tribunal, but to the larger community observing the trial. "I have served Rome faithfully for 30 years, he declared, his voice carrying the conviction of genuine belief. "Every question I have raised, every concern I have expressed, has been motivated by my desire to see our great empire continue to flourish. I have never acted against the interests of the state, nor have I ever harbored thoughts of rebellion or resistance to lawful authority." His defense was articulate and moving, touching on his years of public service, his contributions to various civic projects, and his consistent record of loyalty to successive emperors. He spoke of his love for Rome and his commitment to its continued greatness, presenting himself not as an enemy of the state, but as a concerned citizen whose only crime was caring too deeply about the empire's future. But Prosecutor Maximus was prepared for this defense. In his closing argument, he acknowledged Crispus's apparent sincerity, while suggesting that the most dangerous threats to public order often came from those who believed they were acting in the public interest. "The accused speaks of love for Rome," Maximus argued, "but true love requires trust in the wisdom of those whom Providence has placed in positions of leadership. To question their judgment is to suggest that one's own understanding surpasses that of men who bear the enormous responsibility of governing our vast empire." This argument struck at the heart of the new understanding of citizenship that had evolved under imperial rule. Individual judgment, however well-intentioned, was inherently suspect when it led to conclusions that differed from official policy. The highest virtue was not independent thinking but loyal compliance, not constructive criticism but enthusiastic support. The tribunal's deliberation was brief. Tribune Marcellus announced that while they recognized Crispus's good intentions and distinguished record of service, they could not ignore the evidence that his recent activities had shown a troubling pattern of insufficient confidence in imperial leadership. In the interest of preventing the spread of such attitudes among other citizens who might be influenced by his reputation and eloquence, they had determined that corrective action was necessary. The sentence was exile to a remote estate in southern Gaul, far from the political centers where his influence might pose problems. His property in Rome would be confiscated to compensate the state for the costs of the investigation and trial. His family would be permitted to accompany him, but their names would be removed from public monuments and honorary inscriptions. The erasure was not just political but historical, designed to ensure that future generations would have no record of his contributions to civic life. The announcement of the sentence was met with respectful silence from the assembled crowd. There were no demonstrations of support for Crispus, but neither were there expressions of approval for his punishment. The audience seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that could happen to any of them, under the right circumstances, and that their proper role was to observe quietly and draw appropriate lessons from what they saw. As Crispus was led away to begin his exile, many in the crowd reflected on the broader implications of what they had witnessed. The trial had followed proper legal procedures. The evidence had been presented fairly, and the sentence was within the bounds of established law. Yet something about the proceedings left thoughtful observers with a sense of unease that they found difficult to articulate. Perhaps it was the way that ordinary conversations had been transformed into evidence of disloyalty. Perhaps it was the suggestion that good intentions were no defense against charges of harmful activity. Perhaps it was the recognition that intellectual curiosity and independent thinking had become liabilities rather than virtues in the new social order. In the days following the trial, the effects rippled through Roman society in ways both subtle and profound. Senators became more careful in their public statements, avoiding any language that might be interpreted as questioning imperial wisdom. Citizens modified their dinner conversation, steering away from topics that might lead to dangerous territory. Teachers adjusted their lessons to emphasize obedience and loyalty rather than critical thinking and independent analysis. The trial of Lucius Antonius Crispus had served its intended purpose perfectly. It had demonstrated the consequences of crossing poorly defined boundaries, while maintaining the appearance of legal fairness and due process. It had shown that even distinguished citizens with unblemished records of service were not immune from punishment if their behavior failed to meet evolving standards of loyalty. Most importantly, it had educated the entire community about the new expectations that govern public and private life under imperial rule. The theater of justice had performed its role in the larger drama of social control, using the familiar forms of legal procedure to advance the less familiar goals of political conformity. Citizens left the basilica that day with a clearer understanding of their place in the social order and the behaviors that would keep them safe within acceptable boundaries. Yet, the true measure of the trial's success would be seen not in its immediate effects, but in the long-term changes it produced in how Romans thought about the relationship between individual conscience and state authority. The gradual internalization of the lessons demonstrated that day would prove more effective than any amount of direct coercion in creating the compliant, watchful society that imperial administrators sought to maintain. As evening fell over the 7 hills and citizens returned to their homes, Many found themselves reflecting on the events they had witnessed with a mixture of understanding and unease. The trial had been conducted fairly, according to established procedures, but something essential had changed in their understanding of what it meant to be a Roman citizen. The freedom to think and speak independently, which their ancestors had considered a fundamental right, had quietly transformed into a privilege that could be revoked for reasons that remained deliberately unclear. Chapter 4. The language of compliance in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, where emperors had walked for generations, and the very stones seemed to whisper of power and authority, stood the imperial archives, a vast complex of buildings where the written records of empire were maintained and preserved. Here, among scrolls and tablets that chronicled everything from tax assessments to military dispatches, worked a scholar named Gaius Plotius Firmianus. Firmianus had dedicated his life to the study of language and rhetoric, following in the tradition of the great Roman orators who had shaped public discourse for centuries. His particular interest lay in how words could be crafted to persuade, to inspire, and to move human hearts toward noble purposes. He had always believed that eloquence was one of Rome's greatest achievements, the ability to resolve conflicts through reasoned debate rather than brute force. But as he went about his daily work of cataloging and copying official documents, Firmianus began to notice subtle changes in the language that surrounded him. The formal proclamations and administrative directives that crossed his desk reflected a gradual shift in how power expressed itself through words. Where previous generations had emphasized persuasion and explanation, contemporary documents relied more heavily on assertion and command. The transformation was not dramatic or sudden. Rather, it resembled the slow change of seasons, barely perceptible from day to day, but unmistakable when viewed across longer periods. Firmianus found himself creating informal notes about these linguistic patterns, not from any particular suspicion or concern, but from the scholarly curiosity that had always driven his work. What he discovered was a systematic restructuring of political language that paralleled the broader changes in Roman society. Concepts that had once carried complex meanings were being simplified and standardized. Words that had previously encouraged reflection and debate were being replaced with terminology that demanded immediate acceptance and compliance. The word loyalty, for instance, had evolved in fascinating ways. In earlier periods, it had implied a complex relationship involving mutual obligations and respected boundaries. Citizens owed loyalty to the state, but the state also had responsibilities to its citizens. Leaders earned loyalty through their wisdom and justice, and that loyalty could be withdrawn if they failed to meet their obligations. Under the current system, loyalty had become much simpler and more absolute. It meant unquestioning support for whatever policies the emperor announced, regardless of their content or consequences. It required not just compliance with imperial directives, but enthusiastic endorsement of them. Most importantly, it demanded that citizens demonstrate their loyalty through public words and actions rather than maintaining it as a private conviction. Similarly, the concept of patriotism had undergone significant redefinition. Where it had once meant love of country, expressed through civic engagement and constructive criticism, it now meant love of country expressed exclusively through support for current leadership. The notion that one might serve Rome's interests by questioning imperial policies had become not just obsolete but actively dangerous. Firmianus observed these changes with the fascination of a scholar studying linguistic evolution, but gradually he began to understand their broader implications. Language was not simply reflecting changes in Roman society, it was actively shaping those changes by making certain thoughts easier to express while rendering others nearly impossible to articulate. Clearly, the process worked through what he came to think of as conceptual impoverishment. Citizens found themselves with fewer and fewer words available to express complex political ideas. The rich vocabulary that had once allowed for nuanced discussions of governance, justice, and civic responsibility was being systematically reduced to a smaller set of turgid, predetermined meanings. This linguistic control operated through multiple channels. Educational institutions taught approved definitions of key concepts, gradually training new generations to think within prescribed boundaries. Official documents consistently used terminology in ways that reinforced desired interpretations. Public ceremonies and speeches provided models of correct language use that citizens were expected to emulate in their own communications, perhaps most effectively. The system encouraged citizens to police their own language use and that of others around them. People learned to notice when someone used terminology in ways that deviated from approved norms, and to interpret such deviations as potential signs of disloyalty. This created a form of social pressure that was more effective than any official censorship in ensuring linguistic conformity. Firmianus witnessed this process firsthand in his interactions with colleagues and friends. Conversations that had once been characterized by intellectual curiosity and creative expression became more constrained and predictable. People began to speak in formulas rather than developing their own ways of expressing ideas. The spontaneous eloquence that had once been the mark of an educated Roman gave way to careful recitation of approved phrases and concepts. Psychological effects of this linguistic control were subtle but profound. When people cannot express certain ideas clearly, they tend to think about them less frequently and less deeply. Complex political concepts that require nuanced language gradually fade from consciousness. If the words needed to discuss them become unavailable or dangerous to use, Firmianus began to notice this in his own thinking. Ideas that had once seemed important and worthy of exploration started to feel less compelling when he could not find appropriate words to develop them fully. The intellectual habits that had sustained his scholarly work for decades began to shift as he unconsciously adapted to the constraints of the new linguistic environment. The process was reinforced by changes in what types of writing and speaking were rewarded or punished in Roman society. Authors who demonstrated mastery of approved language patterns found their work promoted and celebrated. Those who persisted in using older, more complex forms of expression discovered that their audiences grew smaller and their influence diminished. Public speakers learned to craft their presentations around terms and concepts that would be readily understood and well received by audiences trained in the new linguistic norms. The ornate, intellectually challenging rhetoric that had once distinguished Roman oratory was gradually replaced by simpler, more direct forms of communication that left less room for misinterpretation or independent thought. Religious language underwent similar transformation. Traditional prayers and ceremonies that had emphasized the complex relationship between human and divine authority were modified to stress the emperor's role as the god's representative on earth. Citizens learned to think of their spiritual obligations and their political duties as identical, with both requiring the same unquestioning submission to imperial will, even private. Correspondence began to reflect these changes as letter. Writers became conscious that their communications might be read by others and interpreted for political content. The intimate, personal language that had once characterized friendship and family relationships grew more formal and guarded as people learned to express affection and concern in ways that could not be mistaken for criticism of public policies. Firmianus found himself caught between his scholarly appreciation for these linguistic innovations and his growing concern about their implications for Roman intellectual life. The efficiency with which the new language patterns achieved their goals was undeniably impressive from a technical standpoint. The systematic coordination of terminology across different institutions and social contexts represented a remarkable achievement in social engineering, yet he could not ignore the cost of this efficiency. The rich, complex language that had enabled Romans to grapple with difficult questions and develop nuanced understanding of human nature and political reality was being replaced by a simpler, but far more limited vocabulary that discouraged precisely the kind of thinking that had made Roman civilization great. As the months passed, Firmianus began to notice that his own scholarly work was becoming less adventurous and original. Without quite realizing it, he had begun to avoid research topics that might require him to use language in ways that deviated from approved norms. The intellectual courage that had once driven him to explore difficult questions gave way to a more cautious approach that prioritized safety over discovery. The transformation was not complete or uniform. In private moments, often late at night when he worked alone in the archives, Firmianus could still access the older ways of thinking and expressing complex ideas. But these moments became less frequent as the new linguistic patterns became more deeply ingrained in his consciousness. The true genius of this system of linguistic control lay in its ability to reshape thought while maintaining the appearance of intellectual freedom. Citizens could still read, write, and speak on a wide range of topics, but only within carefully managed parameters that ensured their conclusions would support, rather than challenge, the existing order. This represented a more sophisticated approach to managing dissent than simple censorship or punishment. Rather than suppressing dangerous ideas after they were expressed, the system prevented them from being formed clearly in the first place. Citizens who could not articulate their concerns in coherent language were unlikely to develop those concerns into organized resistance. As Firmianus reflected on these developments, he realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history: the systematic restructuring of an entire language to serve political purposes. The implications extended far beyond the immediate practical goals of maintaining imperial control. Future generations of Romans would inherit a linguistic environment that had been deliberately designed to limit their capacity for independent political thought. The weight of this realization settled over him like the shadows that crept across the archive floors each evening as the sun set behind the 7 hills. He understood that he was both observer and participant in a transformation that would affect not just his own generation, but countless generations of Romans yet to be born. The language they would use to understand themselves and their world was being shaped in the present moment by forces they might never fully recognize or understand. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Shadows. The transformation of Roman society under the new understanding of loyalty and state security had penetrated into every corner of daily life, touching even the most humble citizens in ways they could barely comprehend. In a modest apartment near the Aventine Hill, where the sounds of river commerce mixed with the calls of street vendors, lived Titus Flavius Sabinus with his wife Cornelia and their 2 young children. Sabinus worked as a fuller, cleaning and preparing woolen garments for Rome's citizens. It was honest work that required skill and attention to detail, though it offered little in the way of wealth or social prominence. Like most Romans of his class, he had always found meaning in the simple virtues of hard work, family loyalty, and devotion to the gods of his ancestors. His world had been bounded by practical concerns, keeping his business profitable, providing for his family, and maintaining the social relationships that made neighborhood life pleasant and secure. But even in this humble corner of the great city, the effects of the new order were becoming apparent. Cornelia had begun to notice changes in how the local women interacted during their daily visits to the neighborhood fountain. Conversations that had once been filled with laughter, gossip, and shared concerns about children and household management now seemed more restrained. Women still gathered to fill their water jugs and exchange news, but their discussions had grown more careful and less spontaneous. The change was particularly evident in how they spoke about their husband's work and their family circumstances. Where they had once freely shared worries about business difficulties or celebrated unexpected successes, they now spoke in more general terms about the blessings of stable employment and the importance of gratitude for imperial protection. The specific personal details that had made their conversations intimate and meaningful had gradually given way to safer, more generic expressions of contentment with their lot in life. Sabinus himself had noticed similar changes in his interactions with customers and fellow tradesmen. The workshop where he cleaned and finished cloth had always been a place where men could speak freely about the challenges of their respective trades, sharing techniques and commiserating about difficult customers or economic pressures. But those conversations had become more circumspect, focusing on technical matters rather than broader concerns about the direction of commerce or the fairness of various regulations. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Where craftsmen had once felt free to grumble about tax collectors or complain about the quality of materials supplied by certain merchants, they now emphasized their appreciation for the stability that strong governance provided. Instead of discussing specific problems they faced in their work, they spoke in general terms about the importance of patience and adaptation to changing circumstances. These changes reflected a broader transformation in how ordinary Romans understood their relationship to authority. The traditional Roman concept of citizenship had emphasized both rights and responsibilities. Citizens owed service to the state, but they also had legitimate expectations about how they would be treated in return. This balanced understanding had given even humble citizens a sense of dignity and agency in their interactions with power. Under the new system, citizenship had become primarily about obligations rather than rights. Citizens were expected to demonstrate their loyalty through compliance and gratitude, while questions about the fairness or wisdom of official policies were increasingly seen as signs of dangerous thinking. The reciprocal nature of the relationship between citizen and state had been quietly replaced by a more one-sided arrangement that demanded submission without offering corresponding protections. The effects of this transformation were particularly visible in how parents spoke to their children about authority and obedience. Sabinus and Cornelia had been raised in families where children were taught to respect their elders and follow proper customs, but also to think for themselves and develop their own judgment about right and wrong. The goal had been to raise young people who could contribute to their communities as independent, responsible adults. Now they found themselves teaching their children different lessons. While they still emphasized the importance of respect and obedience, they also stressed the dangers of questioning established authorities or expressing views that might be misunderstood by others. Their 8-year-old son, Marcus, had already learned to be careful about what he said outside the family home, understanding that certain topics were best avoided in conversations with other children or adults. This early training in self-censorship troubled both parents, though they recognized its necessity in the current environment. They wanted their children to be safe and successful, which increasingly meant teaching them to conform rather than to think independently. The values they had hoped to pass on, intellectual curiosity, moral courage, and honest expression of one's convictions, had become liabilities that could endanger their children's future. Prospects. The neighborhood where they lived provided a microcosm of the broader changes affecting Roman society. The local priest of Mercury, who had traditionally offered guidance on moral and spiritual matters, while maintaining some independence from political concerns, had begun to incorporate more explicit references to imperial authority into his religious ceremonies. Prayers that had once focused on the god's protection of the community now emphasized divine support for the emperor's policies and the importance of civic obedience as a form of religious duty. The children's informal games and activities also reflected the new atmosphere, where previous generations had played at being soldiers, merchants, or mythical heroes. The current generation of neighborhood children increasingly incorporated elements of imperial ceremony and loyalty demonstrations into their entertainment. Their play had become more structured and less imaginative, reflecting the broader social pressure toward conformity and correct behavior. Even the local festivals and celebrations had evolved to serve the new political order. Traditional holidays that had celebrated seasonal changes, honored local gods, or commemorated historical events were gradually modified to include demonstrations of loyalty to the emperor and appreciation for imperial protection. The spontaneous, community-centered nature of these celebrations gave way to more formal, politically oriented ceremonies that emphasized unity and obedience rather than local identity and cultural tradition. The economic dimensions of the new order also affected families like that of Sabinus and Cornelia. While trade and commerce continued to flourish in many ways, the increased scrutiny of business relationships and political associations made certain types of economic activity more risky. Merchants and craftsmen learned to be careful about their partnerships and customer relationships, avoiding connections that might be interpreted as politically questionable. This caution extended to the guild associations that had traditionally provided mutual support and advocacy for tradesmen. These organizations continued to exist and performed their economic functions, but their role in representing members' interests to government authorities became more limited. Guild leaders learned to focus on technical and administrative matters while avoiding broader questions about trade, policy, or the fairness of various regulations. The cumulative effect of these changes was the creation of a society that appeared stable and content on the surface while experiencing significant psychological strain beneath. Families like that of Sabinus and Cornelia adapted to the new expectations and found ways to maintain their daily routines and relationships within the modified social environment. But the constant need for vigilance and self-censorship created a persistent, low-level anxiety that affected their overall quality of life. Children growing up in this environment learn to navigate complex social expectations from an early age, developing sophisticated skills in reading social cues and adapting their behavior to different contexts. While these abilities might serve them well in the imperial system, they came at the cost of the intellectual independence and moral clarity that had characterized previous generations of Roman citizens. The transformation was not complete or uniform. In private moments within their own homes, families could still express genuine thoughts and feelings to some extent. But even these intimate spaces were affected by the awareness that children might repeat conversations outside the home, or that visitors might misinterpret casual comments as evidence of disloyalty. As the seasons changed and the new social order became increasingly normalized, families throughout Rome found themselves adapting to a reality that their parents and grandparents would have found difficult to recognize. The external forms of Roman life, the festivals, the markets, the neighborhood gatherings continued much as they always had. But the spirit that animated these activities had been subtly but fundamentally altered. The promise of security and stability that the new order offered was real and tangible. Crime rates had decreased, food supplies remained reliable, and the various services that made city life possible continued to function efficiently. For many citizens, these practical benefits seemed to justify the restrictions on political expression and social spontaneity that had accompanied them. Yet thoughtful individuals like Sabinus and Cornelia sometimes wondered about the long-term costs of the trade-offs they had accepted. They had gained security and predictability, but they had lost something harder to define, a sense of agency and authenticity in their relationships with both authority and each other. The question that lingered in quiet moments was whether future generations would even remember what had been sacrificed to achieve the current stability. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Consent in the Grand Plaza before the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, where the morning sun illuminated the marble columns that had witnessed centuries of Roman ceremony. Citizens gathered for the monthly celebration of imperial achievements. The ritual had evolved gradually over recent years, transforming from occasional Thanksgiving ceremonies into regular demonstrations of civic unity and political loyalty. Senator Gaius Aurelius Valentinus stood among the assembled crowd, his toga carefully arranged to display the purple stripe that marked his senatorial rank. Once, such gatherings had been opportunities for genuine public discourse, where citizens could hear announcements of policy and offer their own perspectives on the challenges facing the empire. Now they served a different purpose, providing a forum for the collective expression of support for imperial decisions that had already been made and implemented. The ceremony began with the ritual reading of recent imperial accomplishments, military victories, successful diplomatic negotiations, completed public works projects, and improvements in the administration of justice. Each announcement was greeted with carefully orchestrated expressions of appreciation and approval from the assembled citizens. The rhythmic pattern of declaration and response created an atmosphere of unanimous enthusiasm that masked the complex individual reactions of those present. Valentinus participated in these demonstrations with the dignity expected of his position, but his trained eye could observe the subtle mechanics by which popular consent was manufactured and maintained. The citizens who attended these gatherings were not randomly selected from the general population. They included a substantial proportion of individuals whose livelihoods depended directly on imperial favor, government employees, military veterans, recipients of state subsidies, and merchants whose businesses relied on official contracts. These core supporters provided the enthusiastic foundation for each ceremony, ensuring that expressions of approval would be immediate and sustained. Their genuine excitement, based on their real material interests in the empire's success, created an atmosphere that encouraged similar responses from other attendees who might otherwise have remained neutral or skeptical. The psychological dynamics of crowd behavior amplified this effect. Citizens who arrived at the ceremony with reservations about particular policies found themselves swept up in the collective enthusiasm of their neighbors. The human tendency to conform to group behavior, combined with the social pressure to demonstrate proper civic spirit, created conditions where dissenting views were not merely discouraged but became genuinely difficult to maintain. Valentinus had studied rhetoric and philosophy in his youth, and he recognized the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that informed these ceremonies. The timing, the setting, the structure of presentations, and the management of audience responses all reflected careful planning designed to maximize emotional impact while minimizing opportunities for critical reflection. The physical arrangement of the gathering space contributed to this effect. Citizens were organized in sections that mixed different social classes and occupations, preventing the formation of groups that might develop and express alternative viewpoints. The placement of enthusiastic supporters throughout the crowd ensured that expressions of approval would emerge from multiple directions, creating the impression of spontaneous, universal consent. The content of the presentations was also carefully crafted to emphasize achievements and benefits while minimizing discussion of costs or complications. Military victories were described in terms of glory and security rather than casualties and expense. Economic policies were presented through examples of individual success, stories rather than statistical analyses of broader impacts. Social programs were illustrated, with testimonies from grateful beneficiaries, rather than examinations of their long-term sustainability. This selective presentation of information was not technically dishonest. The achievements cited were real, and the benefits described were genuine. But the systematic exclusion of contrary evidence created a misleading impression of universal success and unanimous satisfaction. Citizens who attended these ceremonies regularly gradually internalized a version of reality that emphasized the empire's strengths while obscuring its weaknesses and contradictions. The ceremonies also served to normalize the concentration of decision-making power in imperial hands by presenting complex policy choices as technical matters that required specialized expertise rather than democratic deliberation. Citizens were encouraged to appreciate the results of imperial decisions without concerning themselves with the processes by which those decisions had been reached or the alternatives that had been considered and rejected. Conversations that had once ranged freely across personal concerns, family news, and observations about local conditions now seemed to follow more predictable patterns and avoid certain topics entirely. The change was most evident in how people responded to unexpected events or unusual circumstances. When a neighbor's son was arrested on suspicion of involvement in a fight that had gotten out of hand, the traditional response would have been immediate community mobilization to offer support, gather information, and provide assistance to the family during their time of trouble. Instead, the incident was met with expressions of concern and sympathy, but also with a noticeable reluctance to become too deeply involved in the situation. Neighbors offered help with immediate practical needs, like caring for younger children or managing household tasks, but they avoided discussions about the legal proceedings or the circumstances that had led to the arrest. The collective response was compassionate but cautious, supportive but carefully limited in scope. This pattern repeated itself in response to other difficult situations: job losses, business failures, family conflicts, and health problems. The community continued to provide assistance and comfort, but always within boundaries that reflected new understandings about the potential risks of becoming too closely involved in other people's troubles. Fundinus recognized the wisdom of this caution, even as he mourned the loss of the more intimate community bonds it replaced. In the current environment, any association with someone who attracted official attention could potentially create problems for their friends and neighbors. The prudent course was to maintain friendly but not intimate relationships, close enough to provide mutual assistance in ordinary circumstances, but distant enough to avoid being implicated in any extraordinary difficulties that might arise. The end discouraged curiosity about sensitive topics. Maximus observed this process in his own thinking and behavior. He found himself less inclined to seek out information about imperial policies, less interested in understanding the reasons behind various administrative decisions, and more focused on the immediate practical matters that affected his daily work. The intellectual curiosity that had once driven him to stay informed about public affairs gradually atrophied through disuse. The workshop conversations that had once ranged across history, politics, and philosophy now concentrated on technical matters, the properties of different metal alloys, new techniques for achieving particular artistic effects, and the preferences of various customer segments. While these discussions remained intellectually engaging within their limited scope, They represented a significant narrowing of the intellectual horizons that had once characterized Roman commercial culture. This narrowing was reflected in the education that craftsmen provided to their apprentices, where previous generations had been trained not only in technical skills, but also in the broader cultural knowledge that enabled them to serve as informed members of the community. Contemporary apprentices focus more exclusively on the practical aspects of their trade. The integration of technical training with civic education that had once produced well-rounded Roman citizens gave way to more specialized preparation for specific economic roles. The changes in marketplace conversation also affected the relationship between different social classes within Roman society. The workshop had traditionally been one of the few spaces where senators, merchants, craftsmen, and laborers could interact on relatively equal terms, united by their shared interest in the goods being produced or purchased. These cross-class interactions had provided opportunities for citizens from different backgrounds to share perspectives and develop mutual understanding under the new social norms. These interactions became more formal and limited. Customers from the upper classes maintained polite but distant relationships with the craftsmen who served them, while avoiding the kind of extended conversation that might lead to potentially sensitive topics. The democratic character of marketplace discourse gave way to more hierarchical patterns of interaction that reinforced social divisions, rather than bridging them. Maximus also noticed changes in how his fellow craftsmen interacted with each other during the informal gatherings that occurred when work was light or during festival periods. These professional social networks had traditionally provided forums for sharing information about business conditions, discussing common challenges, and developing collective responses to problems that affected their trades. Now, these gatherings focused more narrowly on technical matters and immediate practical concerns. Broader questions about the direction of trade policy, the fairness of taxation, or the effectiveness of various regulations were rarely raised. And when they did surface, they were quickly deflected or answered with expressions of confidence in official wisdom rather than independent analysis. The silence that gradually enveloped these traditional forums for civic discourse was not empty or peaceful. It carried an undercurrent of tension that reflected the psychological strain of constantly monitoring one's own thoughts and expressions for potentially dangerous content. Citizens had not lost interest in the broader questions that affected their lives. They had simply learned that expressing such interest publicly was unwise. This psychological burden was particularly evident in the way people's faces and body language changed during conversations that approached sensitive topics. Maximus could observe the subtle signs of anxiety and self-consciousness that appeared when discussions began to venture beyond safe boundaries. The easy, natural flow of conversation that had once characterized Roman social interaction was replaced by a more careful and calculated approach that required constant attention to potential risks. The long-term effects of this cultivation of silence extended far beyond its immediate political purposes. The gradual erosion of civic discourse undermined the social bonds that had traditionally held Roman communities together. When citizens could no longer engage in the kind of substantive conversation that builds mutual understanding and trust, their relationships became more superficial and instrumental. The intellectual vitality that had once characterized Roman culture also suffered as the range of topics available for public discussion contracted. The creative energy that emerged from the collision of different perspectives and the exploration of challenging questions was gradually channeled into narrower and safer pursuits. Roman society retained its technical competence and organizational efficiency, but it lost much of the intellectual dynamism that had driven its greatest achievements. Perhaps most significantly, the systematic discouragement of civic curiosity and engagement prepared the ground for the more dramatic restrictions on freedom that would follow. Citizens who had learned to accept voluntary limitations on their political awareness and expression were psychologically prepared to accept involuntary limitations when circumstances seemed to require them. The cultivation of silence had achieved something more subtle, but ultimately more effective than direct censorship. It had created a population that censored itself, that avoided dangerous thoughts not because they were prohibited, but because thinking them had become psychologically uncomfortable and socially unrewarding. As Maximus worked at his forge in the quiet hours of early morning, when the sounds of the city were muted and his thoughts could wander freely, he sometimes reflected on the transformation he had witnessed and participated in. The Rome of his childhood had been noisier and more contentious, but it had also been more vibrant and intellectually alive. The current version offered greater predictability and security, but at a cost that was only beginning to become apparent. The question that lingered in these reflective moments was whether the trade-off had been worth making, and whether it was possible to recover what had been lost without also sacrificing what had been gained. But these were precisely the kinds of questions that the new social order discouraged citizens from exploring too deeply or discussing too openly, and so they remain private uncertainties rather than topics for public consideration. Chapter 8. The Memory Keepers in the Quiet Halls of the Athenaeum, where Rome's literary and scholarly treasures were preserved for future generations, worked a librarian named Gaius Cornelius Tacitus. His days were spent among scrolls and tablets that chronicled the achievements and wisdom of centuries past, maintaining the records that connected contemporary Romans to their ancestral heritage. It was work that required not only technical skill in preserving fragile materials, but also deep knowledge of literature, history, and philosophy. Tacitus had always found profound satisfaction in this role as a guardian of collective memory. The texts under his care represented the accumulated wisdom of generations, the speeches of great orators, the observations of historians, the insights of philosophers, and the creative works of poets and dramatists. These writings formed the intellectual foundation upon which Roman civilization rested, providing each new generation with access to the thoughts and experiences of their predecessors. But as he went about his daily work of cataloging, copying, and maintaining these precious documents, Tacitus began to notice subtle changes in which materials were being requested by scholars and students, and which seemed to be falling into neglect. The patterns of use reflected broader shifts in intellectual interest and academic emphasis that paralleled the political changes occurring throughout the empire. Works that examined the nature of political authority, the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, or the relationship between individual conscience and state loyalty were being consulted less frequently. Students who had once been drawn to texts that encouraged critical thinking about governance and justice now seemed more interested in materials that focused on technical subjects or celebrated the achievements of imperial administration. The change was not the result of any official directive or explicit censorship. Rather, it reflected the natural adaptation of scholars and students to an intellectual environment that had become less hospitable to certain types of inquiry. Academic careers increasingly depended on demonstrating loyalty and usefulness to the imperial system, which meant focusing research on topics that supported rather than questioned official policies and assumptions. Tacitus observed this transformation with the mixed feelings of someone who understood both its practical necessity and its cultural cost. The scholars who visited his library were not cowards or Opportunists, they were intelligent individuals, making rational choices about how to pursue their intellectual interests within the gisboneness constraints of contemporary circumstances. But the cumulative effect of these individual decisions was a significant narrowing of the scope of Roman intellectual life. This approach to governance represented a fundamental shift from the republican traditions that had once characterized Roman political life. Where previous generations of citizens had been expected to participate actively in public debate and decision-making, contemporary Romans were trained to serve as appreciative audiences for decisions made by their superiors. The transformation from citizen to subject was accomplished through the gradual redefinition of civic virtue from active participation to grateful compliance. Valentinus observed how effectively this system managed potential sources of opposition. Citizens who might have developed critical perspectives on imperial policies found themselves isolated and uncertain of their own judgment when surrounded by apparent universal approval. The ceremonies created a social environment where expressing dissenting views required not only political courage, but social courage, the willingness to risk appearing foolish or disloyal in front of one's neighbors and peers. The long-term effects of regular participation in these ceremonies extended beyond their immediate political purposes. Citizens who attended them consistently gradually developed emotional attachments to the empire that were based more on shared ritual experiences than on rational evaluation of policies and outcomes. The sense of belonging and purpose that came from participating in these collective expressions of loyalty became a genuine source of satisfaction and identity for many Romans. This emotional investment in the imperial system created powerful psychological incentives for citizens to interpret subsequent events in ways that supported their existing loyalties. When problems arose, they were more likely to blame external enemies or temporary difficulties rather than fundamental flaws in imperial policies. When solutions were proposed, they were more inclined to support approaches that strengthened rather than limited imperial authority. The system also provided safe channels for the expression of frustrations and anxieties that might otherwise have developed into political opposition. Citizens could voice concerns about specific problems while simultaneously expressing confidence in imperial leadership's ability to address those problems. They could acknowledge difficulties while maintaining faith in the overall direction of policy. This combination of limited criticism with fundamental loyalty allowed people to feel that they were thinking independently while actually reinforcing the existing order. The genius of this approach lay in its voluntary nature. Citizens chose to attend these ceremonies and participate in these expressions of loyalty. They were not forced to demonstrate enthusiasm, but they were provided with compelling reasons to want to demonstrate it. The system created conditions where supporting the empire felt like the natural, rational, and socially rewarding choice for most citizens. The ceremonies also served important functions for the imperial administration itself. They provided regular opportunities to gauge public mood and adjust presentations accordingly. Officials could observe which types of announcements generated the most enthusiasm and which seemed to produce more reserved responses. This feedback allowed them to refine their communication strategies and focus on themes that resonated most effectively with their audiences. The information gathered from these events also helped administrators identify potential sources of opposition before they could develop into serious threats. Citizens whose participation in the ceremonies seemed less than enthusiastic could be noted for additional observation, while those who demonstrated exceptional loyalty could be considered for advancement or special privileges. As the morning ceremony concluded and citizens began to disperse back to their daily activities, Valentinus reflected on the sophisticated social engineering he had witnessed. The event had successfully reinforced existing loyalties, marginalized potential opposition, and created a public record of popular support for imperial policies. All of this had been accomplished without any obvious coercion or manipulation. Citizens had participated voluntarily, and many had genuinely enjoyed the experience. The cumulative effect of regular participation in such ceremonies was the creation of a political culture where dissent became not merely dangerous, but psychologically difficult to sustain. Citizens who were regularly immersed in demonstrations of imperial success and popular satisfaction found it increasingly hard to maintain critical perspectives on the system they were celebrating. This transformation of political consciousness represented perhaps the most sophisticated achievement of imperial control. Rather than suppressing opposition through force, the system had created conditions where opposition was unlikely to develop in the first place. Citizens had not been conquered by their government. They had been convinced to conquer themselves. Chapter 7. The cultivation of silence. The workshops and markets that lined the Via Appia buzzed with their usual activity as merchants conducted the business that kept Rome fed, clothed, and supplied with the countless goods that sustained urban life. Among these industrious citizens was Lucius Scribonius Maximus, a skilled metalworker whose bronze vessels and decorative objects had earned him a modest reputation for quality and craftsmanship. Maximus had inherited his trade from his father and grandfather, along with the small shop that occupied the ground floor of their family home. The work required technical skill and artistic sensitivity, but it also provided opportunities for the kind of thoughtful conversation that had always characterized the Roman marketplace. Customers would often linger to discuss the design of commissioned pieces, sharing their preferences and expectations while examining examples of previous work. These conversations had traditionally ranged far beyond the immediate business at hand. While examining a bronze lamp or discussing the details of a decorative bowl, customers and craftsmen would naturally drift into broader topics: the quality of materials available from different suppliers, the changing tastes of Roman consumers, the impact of new trade routes on the availability and cost of raw materials. From these practical discussions, it was only a small step to considering the policies that affected trade and commerce, taxation levels, trade agreements with distant provinces, the regulation of various industries, and the fairness of legal procedures for resolving commercial disputes. The marketplace had always been an informal forum for civic discussion, where citizens could share information and perspectives that helped them understand their place in the larger world. But Maximus had begun to notice changes in the nature of these conversations. Customers still examined his work with the same careful attention to quality and design, but their willingness to engage in broader discussions had diminished noticeably. Topics that had once generated animated debate now produced polite but brief exchanges. Questions that had previously led to extended conversations were answered with non-committal responses that discouraged further exploration. The change was not dramatic or sudden. Rather, it resembled the gradual shift in seasons, barely perceptible from day to day, but unmistakable when viewed across longer periods. Maximus found himself adapting his own conversational style to match the new atmosphere, avoiding topics that might make customers uncomfortable while focusing more exclusively on the technical and aesthetic aspects of his craft. This transformation reflected a broader change in how Romans understood the boundaries between private, commercial relationships and public political discourse. The traditional integration of economic and civic life, where marketplace conversations naturally incorporated discussion of policies affecting trade and commerce, was being replaced by a more segregated, approach that treated business and politics as entirely separate spheres. The new social norms encouraged citizens to focus on their immediate professional responsibilities, while leaving broader questions of policy to be handled by those with official authority to address them. This division of labor was presented as a form of efficiency, allowing specialists to concentrate on what they did best while trusting experts in governance to manage the complexities of imperial administration. But the practical effect was to isolate citizens from the information and perspectives they needed to develop informed opinions about the policies that affected their lives. Craftsmen like Maximus gradually lost touch with the broader economic forces that influenced their trade, while customers became less aware of the practical challenges faced by the producers of goods they purchased. This isolation was reinforced by changes in the flow of information through commercial networks. Merchants and traders who had traditionally shared news and observations from their travels now focused more narrowly on price information and market conditions. The informal intelligence network that had kept Roman citizens informed about developments throughout the empire was quietly replaced by official communication channels that provided more limited and carefully filtered information. The cumulative effect was the creation of what might be called voluntary ignorance, a social condition where citizens gradually lost interest in maintaining the broad awareness of public affairs that had once been considered essential to responsible citizenship. This was not ignorance imposed through censorship or prohibition, but ignorance chosen as the path of least resistance in a social environment that the process was accelerated by changes in educational curricula that reflected new priorities in the training of Rome's future leaders. Traditional subjects like rhetoric and philosophy remained important parts of advanced education, but they were increasingly taught in ways that emphasized technique rather than content, skill rather than judgment. Students learned to construct persuasive arguments and analyze logical structures, but they were discouraged from applying these abilities to potentially controversial subjects. The teaching of history underwent particularly significant modification. Where previous generations had been encouraged to study the past as a source of lessons about human nature and political wisdom, contemporary students were directed toward histories that emphasized the inevitable progress of Roman civilization and the divine favor that had enabled imperial success. Alternative interpretations of historical events, especially those that might suggest different models of governance or citizenship, were gradually de-emphasized or eliminated entirely. This selective approach to historical memory was reinforced through changes in which texts were copied and preserved for future use. Tacitus had always been responsible for making decisions about which aging documents deserved the expense and effort of reproduction, and which could be allowed to deteriorate naturally. These decisions had traditionally been based primarily on scholarly merit and historical significance. Now, he found himself considering additional factors: the potential political sensitivity of various texts, their usefulness for contemporary educational purposes, and their compatibility with current interpretations of Roman values and traditions. While he never deliberately destroyed valuable materials, he began to prioritize the preservation of works that seemed most likely to serve the needs of future scholars working within the evolving intellectual framework. The effect was a gradual shift in the composition of Rome's intellectual heritage. Future generations would inherit a library that provided extensive documentation of imperial achievements and careful analysis of approved subjects, but relatively limited access to alternative perspectives and critical interpretations that had once been considered essential components of Roman culture. This transformation was particularly evident in the treatment of texts that dealt with the Republican period of Roman history. While the basic facts about the Republic's institutions and major events remained available, the spirit of political independence and civic engagement that it characterized Republican culture was gradually being filtered out of academic discourse. Students learned about the Senate's procedures and the tribune's responsibilities, but they were discouraged from exploring the principles of popular sovereignty and limited government that had originally justified these institutions. Tacitus found himself caught between his professional obligations and his growing concern about the long-term implications of these changes. As a librarian, he was committed to preserving and providing access to Rome's intellectual heritage. But as a citizen, he recognized that certain aspects of that heritage were becoming increasingly incompatible with contemporary political requirements. The dilemma was made more complex by the genuine benefits that the new intellectual order provided. Scholarship had become more systematic and better funded under imperial patronage. Academic institutions enjoyed greater stability and resources than they had possessed during the often chaotic conditions of the late Republic. Students received more consistent and thorough training in their chosen fields of study, but these improvements came at the cost of intellectual independence and diversity. The imperial system that provided stability and resources also imposed subtle but significant constraints on the scope of scholarly inquiry. The result was a more efficient but less creative intellectual culture, one that excelled at preserving and transmitting approved knowledge, but struggled to generate new insights or challenge existing assumptions. The changes in library usage patterns also reflected broader social transformations that affected how ordinary citizens understood their relationship to Rome's cultural heritage. The traditional Roman approach to education had emphasized the study of classical texts as a way of developing judgment and character rather than simply acquiring information. Citizens were encouraged to engage actively with the wisdom of the past, adapting ancient insights to contemporary circumstances. Under the new system, the relationship between past and present became more passive and reverential. Citizens were taught to admire their heritage rather than to learn from it, to celebrate Rome's achievements rather than to understand the principles and practices that have made those achievements possible. This shift from active engagement to passive appreciation reflected the broader transformation from citizen to subject that characterized imperial political culture. Tacitus also noticed changes in how scholars from different regions of the empire approached their research and writing. The traditional diversity of perspectives that had enriched Roman intellectual life, reflecting the varied experiences and cultural backgrounds of citizens from different parts of the Mediterranean world, was being replaced by a more homogeneous approach that emphasized unity and consistency rather than creativity and innovation. This intellectual homogenization served important political purposes by reducing the potential for regional differences in education and culture to develop into sources of political opposition. But it also impoverished Roman civilization by limiting the flow of new ideas and alternative approaches that had historically driven intellectual progress. The cumulative effect of these various changes was the creation of what might be called managed memory, a selective preservation and presentation of the past that served contemporary political needs rather than historical accuracy or intellectual honesty. Future generations of Romans would inherit a version of their heritage that had been carefully edited to support imperial authority and discourage critical thinking about fundamental political questions. As evening fell over the Seven Hills and Tacitus prepared to secure the library for another night. He often reflected on his role in this transformation. He had not set out to become an agent of intellectual control, but the practical decisions he made each day about which text to preserve, which to copy, and which to allow to deteriorate inevitably shaped the intellectual resources that would be available to future scholars and citizens. The weight of this responsibility was both humbling and troubling. He understood that he was helping to determine not just what future Romans would know about their past, but how they would think about their present and their possibilities for the future. The library under his care was not merely a repository of information. It was a laboratory where the consciousness of future generations was being shaped through the selective preservation and presentation of cultural memory. The question that haunted him in quiet moments was whether he was serving as a faithful guardian of Rome's intellectual heritage or as an unwitting accomplice in its systematic impoverishment. The answer seemed to depend on perspectives and priorities that extended far beyond his professional competence. But the consequences of his choices would affect the intellectual life of the empire for generations to come. Chapter 9. The weight of watching as autumn painted the hills around Rome in shades of gold and crimson. The rhythm of daily life continued much as it always had. Yet underneath the familiar patterns of work and family, market and ceremony, a new current of awareness flowed through the city. Citizens had learned to navigate this invisible landscape with the same skill they used to avoid puddles after rain or crowds. During festival days, it had become simply another aspect of urban life that required constant, unconscious attention. In the residential district near the Campus Martis, where modest homes housed the families of clerks, artisans, and minor officials, this new reality was perhaps most evident in the changed nature of neighborhood social life. Gaius Manicius Fundinus, a clerk in the grain administration, had lived on the same street for 15 years, and had once known not only his immediate neighbors, but most of the families within several blocks of his home. The relationships had been built through the countless small interactions that constitute community life: borrowed tools, shared meals during festivals, assistance during times of illness or difficulty, and the easy conversations that occurred when people encountered each other while going about their daily business. These connections had created a web of mutual support and informal cooperation that made neighborhood life pleasant and secure. But Fundinus had begun to notice subtle changes in these relationships. Neighbors still greeted each other cordially and continued to offer assistance when needed. But the easy intimacy that had once characterized their interactions had been replaced by something more careful and restrained.